So, lockdown policies doing more harm than good, question mark. And it is a question, and we're going to be discussing it today in an open-ended and nuanced way from a lot of different perspectives, and there is a lot of information in this talk, so I'm going to occasionally pause while we have an opportunity to digest what the various aspects of the argument that I present. And here's the agenda for today's talk. Firstly, we're going to talk about what lockdowns are, and again, try and look at them from a more nuanced way. We tend to look at them in a very either-or way. NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, which are the components of lockdowns, and then also suppression versus elimination strategies. Super important to understand that distinction to make sense also of a lot of the media coverage of how governments have responded to COVID-19. We're then going to look at research on biomedical outcomes. That's mainly from the first phase of the pandemic back in the spring. Because of the lag in peer review research, most of what's now available now comes from that certainly first half, really first months of the pandemic. So it's still very provisional because lockdowns didn't really exist before 2020. So the science on it is very much evolving. We're learning as we go. I'm going to have a look at some cost-benefit analysis research, which is, there's not a huge amount published out there yet, but what there is indicative and interesting, and it's important to include. But they're going to have a look at Sweden in comparison with Norway and Finland, and indeed other countries. And that's on the basis that, of course, Sweden has been at the heart of the discussion about this as well, particularly in relation to lockdowns and their efficacy. And I'm going to reframe that argument slightly. Then we're going to have a look at some data from the USA from the more recent aspects of the pandemic. October to January, which I think is important, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. And then I'm going to present an immune health hypothesis for why lockdowns don't seem to relate to lower mortality. Yeah, so that's going to be a really important part where we really look at what it means to have a healthy functioning immune system, and why that matters so much in the context of COVID-19, and how that further relates to paradigmatic construals of illness and health, the biomedical approach and the biopsychosocial approach, which we're going to talk about and compare, and then some conclusions at the end. So as I say, I hope you find that there's information in this talk that you find illuminating, that it helps you see the issue in new ways, that it casts new light on areas that you didn't previously know about. And importantly, as context, this comes from a journal article that I've been writing over recent months, which is currently under peer review. It's available, the full manuscript is available in preprint, and I've linked it off the homepage of my website, oliverrobinson.info. So if you'd like to have a look at that, that's where all the references are. Any paper, any research that's mentioned today is there. And it is a departure to a degree on what I've written before, although my adult development book is very much about the biopsychosocial approach to development more generally. So there's an important overlap there. But also you'll see on my website that I describe myself as an interdisciplinary thinker. And this is a complex topic. And from the outset, I felt that it could do with an interdisciplinary look, a way in which we can look at multiple levels of analysis at the same time, because lockdowns have so many effects, psychological, economic, biomedical, and many more. We're going to be talking about those today. So I thought I'd turn my interdisciplinary focus to this important contemporary topic. Right, so let's start off with what are we talking about here? What do we mean? The word lockdown is used a lot in scientific research in the media. But it's not an either-or matter. It's not. It's an easy way of construing it. You either do apply a lockdown or you don't. But it's not that simple. So MPI stands for non-pharmaceutical intervention. Anything you can do to combat an illness, a virus, whatever it might be, without drugs. And government non-pharmaceutical interventions are those which are implemented by governments over a state, region, country. These are non-pharmaceutical interventions that we are seeing applied across the world at the moment. Stay-at-home orders, various levels, extreme level would be an example like Peru, where when they applied their lockdown, you're only allowed to leave your house every other day, and men and women were allowed to leave the home on alternate days. So men on one day and women on the other. So every other day you're allowed to leave the home, but it was gender split. And it was very heavily police and militarily enforced. So that's the most extreme. And then across different countries, you've got various levels of stay-at-home order where it's less strictly applied, but the premise is the same, which is stay at home. Household mixing restriction. So not allowed to mix with other households, or a restriction on that. In Germany, you're allowed to mix with a limited number from other households. In the UK at the moment, officially not at all, apart from bubbles, but we'll come back to that. Hospitality venue closure, non-essential business closure, sorry, missing an S there. School, university closure, restrictions on gathering size, symptomatic case quarantine, contact tracing, so test and trace. Border closures at various levels. Again, can be very strict, can be more relaxed, can be specific to certain countries, can be generic. Mask mandates, public transport closures, shielding of the vulnerable, such as those with pre-existing conditions, and the elderly, and that can be done in various ways as well. So those are MPIs. Now, lockdowns tend to be, firstly, they all vary in duration and timing. They all vary whether they're mandatory or advisory. And that lot on the left tend to be construed as elements of lockdown. A lockdown generally is thought to have as a requirement some kind of stay-at-home order, some kind of hospitality and business closures, plus school closure, and some restriction on gathering size. So in a way, it's a package of non-pharmaceutical interventions applied simultaneously in a country to try to, with the intent of trying to lessen the reproductive rate of the virus, and of course lessen hospitalizations and mortality. But it really is super important to point out that that combination of NPIs has been applied in so many ways and with so many different durations, you know, from everywhere from 2 weeks to months, and lots of different kinds of level of sort of legality to it. It's going to be criminal offense. In India, you could have 2 years in prison if you didn't abide by the lockdown. Normally it's fines, but some places it's completely advisory, which makes it not really a lockdown. So you can see here that what we've really got is this global differentiation, lots of governments using different MPIs. Some have really not used any at all, but they are very rare, those cases. So in another really important broad brush distinction is between elimination and suppression approaches, super important in the context of this talk. And an elimination strategy is one where the aim is to keep COVID cases to zero or as close to zero as possible. Not primarily by lockdowns, by complete border closure for up to 2 years, even to the point where residents of the country are only allowed to leave under specific circumstances, because they have to then come back. And so, you know, so there's the border closure is crucial. Intensive test and tracing, and then quarantining and local containment lockdown. So if there's a breakout in a city or a region, there's a temporary lockdown on that state until they manage to get it under control. The countries currently pursuing this are Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, and China. It's very important that 3 of those are island nations, so the capacity to close their borders is much easier than a country with land borders. China obviously is different, but China's a curious case anyway. It's very hard to know, to verify the accuracy of information that comes out of China in terms of how they manage the pandemic. But what we know about Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand is that they have managed to effectively pursue an elimination strategy to this point. But the race is not yet over, and major challenges lie ahead. You can't eliminate forever. At some point, they have to allow the virus in and to allow it to circulate after mass vaccination. And it's still an open question to what extent the vaccination alone will provide population immunity. So there's lots still to come on the elimination strategy. And it's not an option at all for emerging or developing economies that don't have major public health and IT infrastructure. Pretty much every adult has to have a smartphone, pretty much, if you're going to do an elimination strategy. So you can do contact tracing, You also need to be rich enough to afford no tourists or business travelers for up to 2 years, which most countries aren't. You need major infrastructure to close your borders as well, preferably sort of a military force, or certainly a lot of policing involved there if necessary. And if you're somewhere which has ambiguous borders like the UK, closing the Northern Ireland border would be a major issue for the Good Friday Agreement. You would have to in an elimination strategy unless you included Ireland as well. But Ireland is part of the EU, and freedom of movement in the EU makes cutting a state off from the rest of the EU pretty much impossible for 2 years. In the USA, it's completely impossible because COVID policies are set state by state, and you can't cut a state off from the rest of the USA. But importantly, I really want to point out that some countries have been incredibly successful with suppression strategies as well, where the aim is to allow the virus to spread, but to suppress and slow that transmission. This can include lockdowns, UK, Italy, Spain, Peru, many, many countries. But many countries haven't. I could point out Tanzania, Japan, Hong Kong, Sweden, South Korea, and others I'll be referring to as well along the way. So really, my arguments today pertain to the suppression strategy approach. The elimination strategy is something which I'm sure at the next pandemic, more countries will consider. But as I say, the overall cost-benefit arrangement of that is one which will only be determined really probably a couple of years from now. So yes, today we're really talking about lockdowns in the context of suppression strategies, which pertains to about 95% of countries in the world. So let's talk about the research that we do have at the moment. I'm only going to be talking about peer-reviewed research at the moment, I think with one exception. There's lots of research floating around that's not yet through peer review yet. So I'm going to, and again, I'm really going to focus on the highest quality research in the best journals, because there are some sort of minor studies that I've seen sort of floating around in minor journals, but often they're not making a significant contribution to the debate. Right, so let's ping through this. Firstly, research on effects of lockdown interventions on case numbers and case growth. So what do we know about whether the lockdown intervention, which is that combined use of the stay-at-home order, business closure, school closure, what does it do to case growth? Well, Howg et al. In a major study in Nature took data from 226 countries, and actually they took a census data in the 17th of August, but most of the data was from earlier in the year. And they looked at the relationship between the implementation of government interventions and growth in cases over time. This was one of those things that was difficult because so many of the interventions were applied at the same time. So it's very difficult to tease apart their effects, but they used some very clever statistical analysis to do that. And the conclusion was lockdowns reduce the rate of case growth, but less destructive measures, I quote, are just as effective or can be just as effective. So strangely, they found that lockdowns, which are arguably the sort of a combination of the strictest MPIs, aren't necessarily more effective than less restrictive measures. Indeed, they found that just that the measure of cancelling or essentially banning gatherings over a small number of people was as effective as a full lockdown. Lee et al. In the Lancet Infectious Diseases, data from 131 countries, again, a big pan-national study, found a decreasing case growth rate over a period of 28 days was associated with school closures, workplace closures, banning public events, and requirements to stay at home. So they found that it was effective in reducing case growth rate. However, they also found rates rebound after lockdown, often to a higher level than they were before. So they found an issue with a rebound effect. And that's important, of course, because if you only look over the duration of the lockdown and not at the potential for a rebound effect, you'll miss the fact that what do people do when they're not under lockdown? Do you get a sort of yo-yo effect? Browner et al. In Science looked at 7 particular NPIs across 34 European countries and 7 non-European countries. And they found closing educational institutions, limiting gatherings to 10 people or less, closing face-to-face businesses reduced transmission considerably, but they found stay-at-home orders were the least effective. And Ben David et al., which is a recent one, but authors from Stanford, looked at the list of countries you can see there. And their conclusion was that government interventions were associated with reduced case growth in 9 out of 10 countries, but no benefit of restrictive lockdown interventions compared with the less restrictive interventions, which is a curious thing because you kind of assume with these kind of restrictions that the more you apply, the heavier, the more restrictions you put in, the less option for virus transmission there is. So they should become more effective. There's this paradox appearing here where the more restrictive don't seem to work better than the less restrictive, at least across those 4 studies. That seemed to be appearing to be the case. Now, some other studies looked at lockdown interventions and their relation to mortality, specifically COVID-19 mortality. We'll come on to excess mortality later. Chowdhury et al. In the Lancet found that mortality rates were associated across 50 countries, were associated with higher obesity, higher GDP per capita, curiously, higher income inequality, but no association found between mortality and lockdown measures. De Laroche-Lambert et al. Big 188 country data analysis. They found COVID-19 mortality was predicted by a country having higher life expectancy, no surprise, more elderly, higher prevalence of chronic disease such as cancer and heart disease, high level of metabolic risk factors such as obesity. The stringency of government lockdown response was not associated with mortality. Mio et al. Found that when they looked at 27 randomly selected countries and looked at case growth and mortality 15 days before, during, and 15 days after a lockdown, case growth was related to the decline in the rate of growth was associated with lockdowns, but there was no significant decline in mortality between the pre and post measures. Bjorn Skov, which is that is a preprint in SSRN, but I mentioned it anyway because it's a very good study. And he looked at severity of lockdown policies in 24 countries in the first 6 months of 2020, a mortality rate, and there was no association between the uses of lockdown and mortality. So what we can see emerging is that lockdowns do bring down the rate of virus growth. So the R value has an effect, but not necessarily more than less restrictive measures. Mortality, paradoxically, doesn't seem to be so closely linked to them. Now moving on to cost-benefit analysis. 4 studies I found that there may be others. There's an Israeli one, which I mentioned in my article. If you know of any others, do let me know. This is one done by Imperial College, cost-benefit analysis of lockdown in the United Kingdom. And they found there, they said that the lowest estimate for lockdown costs incurred was 40% higher than the highest benefits from avoiding the worst mortality case scenario, full life expectancy tariff. More realistic estimations that they were over 5 times higher. So in other words, the lockdown costs being over 5 times higher than the costs of a worst case mortality scenario. This suggests that the cost of continuing severe restrictions is so great relative to likely benefits in lives saved that a rapid easing of restrictions is now warranted. Treating possible future COVID deaths, if nothing else matters, is going to lead to bad outcomes. Good decision making does not mean paying little attention to the collateral damage that comes from responding to a worst case scenario. Now, these cost-benefit analyses are quite technical. They also make a range of assumptions, but they also look at a whole range of scenarios to build in the fact that there's a lot of unknowns here. And in all their scenarios, there seemed to be an issue of costs incurred being far higher. And they were looking there in terms of the quality adjusted life years, QALYs, which some of you will be aware of. A different approach was taken by Philip Thomas, and his conclusion was a policy of lockdown followed by gradual relaxation is likely to do much more harm to the nation's health and good. The predictable link between GDP per head and population average life expectancy, is a very strong link, suggests that whatever its immediate attractions, the policy of restriction followed by gradual relaxation might, if adopted, become responsible for a net cost in terms of average human lives comparable with the UK's sacrifice over the 6 years of World War II. Now, Thomas is very clear that there's a COVID death is very visible. It's very, it's in there in a graph. Though the deaths that relate to a decline in economic output, to business closures, to unemployment, to all of the economic collateral damage are sort of invisible, and they're spread over many years in the future. So, he was saying that politically, and actually Philip Thomas has given evidence to the government and to the select committee, and he said it's entirely understandable why the government prioritizes that deaths now, political imperative it being very important. But he says that you simply don't make a country healthier by making it poorer. And he shows, for example, that after the 2009 recession, the increasing life expectancy in the UK is flattened out. And he says that if you take into account those kind of effects, you lose millions, literally millions of life years, which amount to hundreds of thousands of deaths. So it's just, again, this is a question of says value judgments implied here about which, when you're taking these different potential effects, how you weight them. For example, Sanjay Reddy, it really focuses on the fact that he feels that if you focus too much attention on a single issue, population health can suffer. So that's really, so he goes into significant length to talk about this population health approach. So, I mean, here's one quote that says, he talks about, towards the end of the quote there, social isolation, poverty, unemployment that relates to lockdown type measures and how they could easily lead to a decline in overall population health, even if they have effects on COVID-19. A more recent one from Jenkins et al. I'll just read the quote out. Policies that require people to stay at home to reduce the morbidity and mortality from COVID-19 will have effects beyond the virus. For example, they will adversely affect mental health and economic prospects for many. They will also affect people's willingness and ability to access health and social services. This is likely to result in increases in morbidity and mortality from other curable diseases, such as cancer, acute myocardial infarction, heart attack, and stroke. A comparison between COVID deaths prevented and excess cancer deaths caused shows that it is possible that preventing COVID-19 deaths through lockdown might result in more life years being lost than saved. Now, of course, it's very difficult to know that without lockdown measures, quite how much would have been disrupted in terms of, say, cancer care provision. But really what you get a sense of here is that those individuals who have been publishing cost-benefit analyses are very unsure about the relative balance of pros and cons. And we haven't even talked about the effects on children yet. Here's a summary of some UK-focused findings and points that have been made here from eminent people in the field. Professor Russell Viner, president of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, said just last month that the pandemic has caused a range of harms to children across the board, from being isolated and lonely to suffering from sleep problems and reduced physical activity. Alongside school closures, all children's sport is currently banned, as it has been at various points during the pandemic. Many experts are baffled by the approach to children's sport, given the low risks of transmission outdoors and the clear benefits for emotional and physical well-being. The NSPCC has pointed out that the amount of counselling for loneliness provided by its Childline service has risen 10%. The relative social isolation of babies and toddlers born since the start of pandemic, some have seen very few other human beings apart from their parents, and health visitors have expressed some major concerns there. And between April and September, there were 285 reports by councils of child deaths and incidents of serious harm. Children's Commissioner for England, Anne Longfield, is worried that this is just the tip of the iceberg, arguing that lockdowns, closure of schools and stay-at-home orders have led to a generation of children becoming invisible to social workers. If you have a look at these mental health statistics, it's important to think about this in the long term. These are huge rises between 2017 and 2020. Let's take, for example, boys aged 5 to 10. Now we've gone, the prevalence of children with probable mental health problems has gone from 11.5 to 17.9%. If you think of that in terms of the number of children that age in the country, we're talking hundreds of thousands potentially. And again, or another very large gap there for teenage girls from 13.9 up to 20.1. And if these mental health problems are not just temporary, if these sow seeds which last for decades, the cost of this is unfathomable. The Youth Index published in January by the Prince's Trust in partnership with YouGov has been tracking the well-being of young people aged 16 to 25 for 12 years. It found that more than half of young people were always or often feeling anxious, the highest level ever recorded. Jonathan Townsend fears young people are losing all hope for their future. Now, again, I just wanted to point out here really is that when you are in a political situation of having to balance these kind of harms to children against COVID deaths, this is not about following the science. This is an ethical value judgment where you're taking very different kinds of potential harm and having to weigh them against each other when they're almost unweighable. It's incredibly difficult, and that's why governments have weighed them in so many different ways. So let's have a look at some specific countries now. And we can't talk about lockdowns without talking about Sweden, because Sweden has widely been taken as the world's control group for lockdowns. When you're trying to establish whether something's effective, what you really need is an example of somewhere where it hasn't applied it, so that you can try and compare the two. Now, Sweden, as we'll come on to later on, has done much better than the UK, but generally it's been compared with its neighbours, Norway and Finland. Denmark as well, but I'll focus on Norway and Finland for now. Outstanding performers in terms of COVID outcomes, particularly through the pandemic. And this is often taken as, well, there's Sweden who've gone for an approach where there's relatively few NPIs, I think by way of a lockdown, versus Norway and Finland. But this is not a good evaluation of lockdowns for a variety of reasons, not least of which is that neither Norway nor Finland has actually applied a lockdown. Not by the agreed OECD definition. They've never had a stay-at-home order. They've never had any restriction on mixing with different households. So what have they done? Well, Norway, they had schools, gyms and hair salons shut, large events banned, some restrictions on restaurants, but not shut, borders shut, no restriction on domestic travel, advisory guidance, work from home, travel as little as possible, particularly people with symptoms should stay at home. And they've been selective with border restrictions since then. Finland, what did they do? Schools closed, 10 people max for public meetings, over 70s avoiding contact, borders shut temporarily, a couple of months, returning citizens under quarantine, people with symptoms should stay at home, and selective border restrictions since then. You know, the level of freedom that citizens in Norway and Finland experienced during their lockdowns would be considered to be, you know, far greater than what the British people have been experiencing in lockdowns. And I'll come back again to the British approach to lockdowns, which I think is, well, might help to explain why the UK has been such an extraordinary failure in terms of mortality rates. Furthermore, Sweden is demographically very different from its neighbours. 20% of Sweden were born in a different country. It's much higher than Norway, much higher than Finland. And sadly, the fact is that it is these immigrant groups that have had the highest levels of COVID-19 morbidity and mortality. And that echoes an awful statistic that's been echoed across countries, is that low socioeconomic groups, people in disadvantaged situations, and we see that with first generation and second generation immigrants to some degree, have been disproportionately affected. And so that's part and parcel of what's going on there. So that's part of the issue. Now, in terms of the issue of sort of the government response stringency, there's also the fact that Sweden, apart from the early stage of the pandemic, has been rated by the Oxford University government stringency tracker there you can see Sweden's the black line. It's pretty much being on the same level of government response stringency as Germany, Switzerland, Spain, France, UK, and Italy, right in the mix anyway. Now I can show you here with a bit of luck. Some of you may have been on this website before, and I'm aware I'm going to have to flip my screen share for this to work, so fingers crossed. Okay, so fingers crossed now you can see the website of the Oxford University Coronavirus Government Response Tracker. Nikolai, let me know if you can't see it.
It's good, Ollie.
Cool. So they've got this rather neat little visualization here. The darker the color, the stricter the measures currently being applied. And you can see I can move through time. Now, for now, I just want you to focus on Scandinavia, and then we'll have a look at a few other things. So if we go right down into March, when we get the restrictions, you can see we get to about March, and you can see that Finland and Norway are darker color than Sweden. And they continue that way until April. And we can see there that Sweden is about the same, is rated the same as Finland, pretty dark blue, not as dark as the rest of Europe. And if I just go forward, you'll see that from about April the 28th, Sweden, Norway, and Finland are rated as pretty much the same level of stringency. In fact, Sweden gets even stringent, they're more stringent there in May, stays that way, darker blue, stays that way, and then changes a bit in November. But again, Sweden being stricter. So, and then we've got Norway going into a sort of, well, what it calls a lockdown, but is just a bunch of MPIs that don't quite qualify as a lockdown more recently. So the comparison between Norway, Finland, and Sweden as one which is a good, natural experiment on lockdown versus not is not good. Basically, what we've got there is astonishingly good performance from Norway and Finland, and average performance from Sweden. I'll show you in a minute. But let's have a look at the UK when I run through that once more. Sometimes people go, oh, the UK, they just haven't locked down enough. But trust me, we've been under restrictions for more than pretty much any other country in the world. You can see here, we go dark, we stay dark with a little bit of light there in the summer. But by, as you can see, we're still much darker than the rest of Europe, except for Ireland. And then we never lift out of that dark shade, and we go then dark, 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 a little bit lighter, dark, a little bit lighter. And then we stay. So Britain has been experiencing, at least according to this metric, strict government measures for a very long time compared with many other countries. Let's stick on Sweden for a bit longer. I've said that they're very average. They are. That's the cumulative deaths per million for the EU overall, and then Sweden. And you can see that Sweden is bang on EU average. And you can, but in terms of excess mortality, which is a measure of overall sort of population health and everyone who's dying from any potential disease or condition, not from accidents, we see that Sweden is doing really rather well compared with, say, Spain, Switzerland, and the UK, which are next to it on this particular website. You can see here, this is the March peak. This is the more recent winter peak, and you can see Spain and the UK are these pronounced lift ups in winter and in the spring. And this is relative to population size, so this has nothing to do with Sweden being smaller. It's just a percentage of population Z-score. Switzerland has had a worse time there. Sweden barely lifted out of the sort of normal expectation zone of winter. It did earlier on, but they've done a lot better than the UK and Spain. Some people say, well, they should have, and perhaps they should have performed like Norway and Finland. But the key thing about Norway and Finland is that whatever they've been doing well, it's about taking a middle way between extremes. They've been they implemented some rapid restrictions, nothing which resembles a UK style, Spain, Italy style lockdown, and they've taken it pretty easy since then. And I think we need to look at that kind of middle way approach as well. Then they use, I think really importantly, they use a rapid implementation of border restrictions as well, which seems to be intelligent rather than what the UK is doing, which is implementing border restrictions about a year after the pandemic starts. Right, so moving on to the USA. So just a little bit about natural experiments. Just go through this pretty quickly. So in an experiment, the aim is to establish whether an intervention leads to a change by comparing a group who have been subject to the intervention to a comparison group who have not. It's the control group. In a randomized control experiments, people are randomly assigned to the intervention group and control group to avoid a systematic difference between them that may confound the effect. But in a natural experiment, two or more matched but naturally occurring groups are compared that are not randomly allocated, but are as similar as possible in all ways, other than the fact that one has had the intervention and one has not. Now, we've talked about problems with comparing countries. They differ in all kinds of ways. So you can, if you find a difference, is it because of the demographic differences, because of climate or ethnic composition or pre-existing immunity? It's hard to say, but comparing states within a country, you control that a little more. In the USA, we've got radically different government interventions, or MPIs. And we can select for similar states that are similar in other ways to make for a, a better natural experiment. Here we are. So moving on. But then we need to find states that are well matched and have implemented a lockdown versus no restrictions. And what would be good would be a third state that's also well matched, that's implemented moderate restrictions. And this would give us a sort of middle ground position to see if moderate lockdown measures are dose dependent MPIs. The more you ratchet them up, the fewer cases you have. So Florida, Texas, and California, I'm going to present you data from there as a little natural experiment. Relevant similarities. They're the three most populous states in the USA, so they've got the most people in the top three. Similar in previous exposure to virus before this winter. They all avoided surges in the spring, but all had surges in July and August. All mid-table in terms of performance COVID data in terms of the US states. Highest, Texas is number 4, Florida number 26, California number 32 out of 50 states in terms of deaths per million. So they're all performing sort of mid-table. They all measure cases and deaths in the same way. And this is important because across countries, this is one of the big confounds. Some of the issues with Belgium having such apparently high death rate is apparently in the way they count deaths, particularly in care homes. But we know in the USA that all the states are using CDC criteria. Ethnic composition, all three have high proportion of Hispanics. All three are in the bottom 10 for states in terms of the percentage of non-Hispanic whites. Similar in climate, all three are in the top 10 highest for average temperature in the USA. All three in the top 10 for income inequality, which is an obesity. They're all mid-range, quite similar. Texas a bit higher. I mean, that's all for the USA. That would be pretty high for anywhere else. One key difference is that in Florida, there's a much higher percentage of people aged 65 or over. It's where people go to retire. Florida doesn't have lots of elderly there, and age is the #1 predictor of COVID outcomes. You have a infection mortality rates in the over 70s that are 50 times what you get in those under 40. So Florida is at a disadvantage in that regard when we're comparing the states. But it's also a bit warmer in Florida as well. So just to let you know that California had, again, you can read this in more detail later if you like, but basically they had a lockdown which came really into full force from December the 7th with some measures from November the 16th, and then it ended on the 25th of January. And it was even had a curfew, which we don't have in the UK. In Texas, they had gatherings of more than 10 people prohibited. Bars must close when there's a certain level of COVID patients. There's a mask mandate. There's a bar and restaurants issue, and schools are selectively reopened. And then Florida, since December the 28th, Florida's lifted all government mandated restrictions. There is a mask mandate in some cities, no statewide, and no penalties for non-mask use. And of course, testing, social distancing, all of those measures are upheld. And all of the three states, interestingly, and this is important, had a stay-at-home order, a lockdown in the spring. So they all started on that foundation. So how have things gone for them in this little natural experiment between November and January? Florida, very little government intervention. California, heavy. Texas, moderate. So by the way, California schools have been shut literally since the start of the pandemic. That's an important thing. So you can see there that on the left, the California is the blue line, Florida is the orange line, Texas is the gray line. That's cases per million between October, November, December, and January. If we then simply look at the November to the end of January, you can see that California has the highest case rate overall. Texas has the mid-range, slightly lower, and Florida has the lowest. And then deaths per million, you can see the three lines there. Texas, highest, closely behind is California, and Florida is the lowest. Well, this is by no means perfect. Natural experiments never are. But it might be one of the best we've had yet in terms of the parameters of what we're looking for in a natural experiment. Florida, with its no restriction policy, fared better than both Texas and California. But this is not just an argument against government restrictions. I think an important issue is that Florida went through a lockdown in April, May, and this may have provided an important foundation for behavior later in the year. And what I would show you, but I'm not going to, is that if you go to Google, you can see how much movement there is in an area. So you basically see how much restriction on movement there is that the government restrictions are having. And you can look at that across various parameters. But crucially in Florida, after the intervention, after the government liberalized the arrangements at the end of September, there was no real change in population behavior. People carried on behaving way below baseline in terms of bars, recreation, work, general movement, suggesting that that if you start in the right way and then take the pressure off, that people behave very well. That's a selection of states. This is an interesting graph. That's all states. The red ones are those where they've basically given up on lockdown since the summer of 2020. The blue ones are ones where they've carried on imposing heavy MPIs and lockdowns. And you can see that the two yellow lines, the slightly lower one is the mean of the states where they've lifted lockdowns and they don't use them anymore. Well, and the other yellow line is those of all the other states, and you can see that there's not much difference. What's really interesting in America is that South Dakota has gone free form throughout the whole pandemic. They've really barely imposed a single government intervention. It's by no means at all an exemplar of necessarily how to handle the pandemic, but modeling suggests that their red line there should be about 4 times the height of what it is. So there's something about the modeling of these lockdowns that doesn't work. Why is there not a clear link between mortality rates and lockdown? So I'm going to present a hypothesis here and whip through some evidence. This is given my timing, and this will go up. I'll be talking past 5 o'clock, but we did start past after 5 o'clock. But bear with me; we'll get through it. We'll get there. Want to make sure that that I give you the full picture. So we've talked about the data, but let's try and explain what we're looking at now. So my hypothesis is this. What we know is that not everyone who is infected by COVID develops symptoms of the illness. Recent studies suggest up to 75% of people completely asymptomatic. This is, of course, in large part due to variable immune functioning. There are a number of reliable predictors of healthy immune functioning in the context of respiratory viruses. And what I propose is that extended lockdowns, lengthy lockdowns, create a storm of immunosuppressant effects, unemployment, social isolation, physical inactivity, that may leave a population more susceptible to serious illness and hence death if exposed to SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Particularly those who are already in a disadvantaged or vulnerable situation and so have a high base level of background stress and perhaps of problematic immune functioning already. And these effects may simply cancel out the benefits of lowering viral transmission through contact during lockdowns, hence leading to no real relationship between lockdown and COVID-19 mortality. In the case of the little Florida experiment, they actually seemed to fare better through those months. Now, what we know is that COVID-19, the immune system responds to it in very similar ways to other coronaviruses. Hence, there's several studies now that look at how people who've been exposed to other coronaviruses have less severe COVID-19 because the immune system is primed, so it's not unique in the sense of how the body responds to it. Factors that we know now from decades of research support immune health include healthy eating, low stress, employment, social connection, exercise and physical activity, moderate to low alcohol intake, and not smoking, amongst other things. And there's a Harvard Health Publishing page where you can read through precisely those points as a summary of the scientific data. So again, there's lots that's written on nutrition and the immune system. You can see this piece here saying nutrition is a critical determinant of immune response, and malnutrition the most common cause of immunodeficiency worldwide. There's thousands of papers written on this, but do lockdowns affect nutrition? Not in developed countries or affluent countries necessarily, but in developing countries, yes. In Kenya, the lockdown left people so hungry that there was a rise in poaching giraffes. You can see here, for many young people around the world, the economic effects of lockdown, people are going hungry. You can see here, Peru and Brazil, a piece on the Wall Street Journal saying, stay home and starve, harsh restrictions that people couldn't obey. And the people, and some did starve. So there was a question of they either break quarantine or their family becomes malnourished. So this is one reason why a one-size-fits-all doesn't work. We know that physical activity is critical to immune function. There's one paper of many. Acute exercise, improved defense activity, metabolic health, anti-inflammatory activities. Has lockdowns affected our activity levels? Absolutely. An unprecedented fall in activity levels. There's a scientific piece on it there. How do we deal with that fact? Potential detrimental health effects of lockdown, physical inactivity. Unemployment and social disconnection. These stresses are known to seriously disrupt immune function. Interestingly, in terms of the link between stress and COVID outcomes, I found a paper just recently that even kind of put together a little schematic of the link between psychological stress, biological processes, and severity of COVID-19 outcome. So this has been already published, so this is out there. Now we know that unemployment has a major effect on immune function. There's a good example of a paper on that. We know that loneliness has a very profound effect on immune function and mortality. Indeed, loneliness is a major predictor of mortality. So we've got here meta-analysis of studies that finds social isolation measured objectively or subjectively. We're looking at an increased risk of death of 26% for reported loneliness, 29% for social isolation, 32% for living alone. Those are not small effect sizes. And this is an excellent book on the science of loneliness, talking about how loneliness leads to compromised immune functioning and that if we allow mass loneliness to occur, to use their quote, to use their phrase, we may be hastening millions of people to an early grave. This fascinating work by Sheldon Cohen. He gets a group of people, viral challenge research design, a screen for good health. He then squirts a virus up their nose, either flu, a coronavirus or a rhinovirus, not COVID, and then looks to see who gets ill. He finds that about 25% to 40% get ill. So first and foremost, we know for sure that exposure to these pathogens is not definitive of getting ill. Same as we know that of COVID as well. He's run decades of these studies. Who gets ill after having a virus squirted up their nose? Well, people under chronic stress. The longer the participant's most stressful event lasted, the greater their probability of getting sick. The most immunosuppressant stressors, interpersonal problems, being unemployed, social isolation. And then there's smoking and lack of exercise as well, which they found. Has lockdown affected loneliness? Yes, and the longer it goes on, the worse it's got. Lockdown loneliness reaches record levels. Back in November, reporting the highest ever levels of loneliness ever recorded in the UK. And there's another piece on that. And now I'm going to link this back. My hypothesis here is that the fact that lockdowns exacerbate these issues means that even if there's reduced transmission of virus, people may be more susceptible to illness. Can we explain the UK, or at least potentially explain the UK in this way? The UK has spent more money per capita on COVID than any other country in the world. At last count, it was November, it was about 280 billion. So it's probably over 300 billion now. That's about 3 million per saved death, £3 million per saved death. It also has the highest mortality rate of any large country in the world. An extraordinary combination of factors. What could explain this? Well, for a while, I was thinking that the way that the UK has run their government non-pharmaceutical interventions has an astonishing capacity for social isolation. If people live alone and they can't bubble because the household they would bubble with is already bubbled with someone else, or they just don't know anyone in the area, you've got people who are in solitary confinement in this country for months on end. Other countries have not run their lockdowns that way. They've provided more of a safety net. And while I'm sure, does this stack up? Well, hey presto, there's a piece from The Lancet just the other day, came out on January the 19th, comparing loneliness across a whole bunch of countries. And well, have a look at the data. Denmark, France, Netherlands, and the UK. And then it's got loneliness levels in people who've had no chronic disease and previous chronic disease, no mental illness and previous mental illness. Look at those bars. For people who have had previous disease and previous mental illness, levels of loneliness are far higher in the UK, particularly the mental illness, previous mental illness bar. Has the UK strategy been undone by the immunosuppressant effects of highly vulnerable people being incredibly lonely for months on end, and this compromising their immune health to the point where they're simply not able to handle COVID if they do encounter it? Now, I'm not saying that that's definitely the case. I'm saying it fits with my hypothesis, and in any respect, that graph should be a concern. So possible counter-arguments to my argument. Well, if further data-led research convincingly shows that lockdowns, as part of a suppression strategy, drive mortality rates down by a highly significant amount over an extended period of time, more than non-lockdown MPIs, this would undermine my argument that immunosuppressant effects cancel out the benefits accrued. So we'll just have to, there'll be more data coming out, so we'll see. And if countries and states that have not used or have given up on lockdowns, ultimately over the course of the pandemic show much worse outcomes over time than comparable countries or states, this would also be evidence against my argument. As you'll have seen there, currently in the USA, the data suggests that it's neither here nor there on COVID with lockdowns or not. But the race is not yet run. Part of the challenge is that people have been making judgments as the pandemic's unfolded, and then suddenly a country radically changes in its profile. Like Denmark's just suddenly had a big spike, which it has, and other places. It's hard to know exactly how things are going to pan out in terms of the whole thing. And sometimes I think that it's been very reactive rather than applying clear principles. And I do think that one of the other big shortcomings of the UK is that its strategy has been exacerbated huge levels of uncertainty and anxiety and fear, whereas some countries have managed to maintain a more consistent public health messaging based on clear information. So my last point is, and if research showed that stress and physical inactivity are not involved in the immune response to COVID, that would negate my argument. But the chance of that is vanishingly slim, but the research is still to be done. So we'll wait and see. So yeah, my last few slides are, is this a paradigm issue? Has the government response in many countries been led by a sort of reductionist biomedical model, which is based on exposure to pathogens only, rather than on biopsychosocial models of health and what it means to be healthy or get ill? It's interesting that back in 2012, the president of the American Psychological Association said, for more than a century, the biomedical model has been the dominant force in Western medicine, postulating that disease is a product of biological defect, initiated biological pathogen. Model is reductionist, seeking to explain all disease in biological terms. And then she goes on to talk about that medicine's now embracing the biopsychosocial model, which you can see in the second paragraph. Well, she may have been right, but I don't think that it's gone that far, in 2020. And the biomedical model still seems to be very much dominant, certainly in terms of what happens when a virus hits. Mind you, I think that countries that have responded better have responded by taking care of, or at least counterbalancing, the biological imperatives of virus transmission with psychological and social well-being. If you look at this interesting diagram that I found comparing the two, and just look down the left, it really does look like the kind of precipitating rationales, the precipitating rationale that you would expect for that leads to heavy lockdowns at the expense of all those factors that we know support biopsychosocial health. We can see here, on the right, psychological and social factors playing a significant role in the context of disease. And we know now for sure that exposure to pathogens is not sufficient to get ill. You can have two people with exactly the same amount of virus in, and one of them is completely fine, and one of them isn't. One of them is very ill. And that's been shown over and over. So I don't think the biopsychosocial model negates the importance of strict NPIs. I think it's about the fact that you need to consider biological, psychological, and social as critical determinants of health, not one being dominant and the other just being, flouncy. And that if we're going to measure which country has done well in the pandemic, yes, we look at COVID stats. Yes, we look at overall population health stats, but we also look at social cohesion and social connection. To what extent has that been ripped up? We look at child development outcomes. We look at maintenance of civil liberties and quality of life, as long as we believe that life is for living. Every ethical system, every medical ethical system ever invented has included the importance of well-being, of happiness, of minimizing misery, not just of staying alive. And then, of course, economic outcomes, in the knowledge that they dictate so much of what provides for a functional health system. And the fact that unemployment statistics are predictors of depression, mortality, and so on, and getting ill. So thanks for staying with me. Just been a bit over an hour. In conclusion, the link between lockdowns and reduced mortality is pretty weak. But we're, say the race is not yet run. This is how it stands at the moment. It is not a matter of lockdowns or letting it rip. There are many non-lockdown and non-pharmaceutical interventions that governments can use. And a biopsychosocial perspective, I think, should counterbalance virus exposure with helping to ensure population health. And some countries, I believe, have done that satisfactorily, some very well. Sadly, the UK has not. The stay-at-home order may be potentially the least effective NPI, but the most destructive, according to the evidence as it stands. The collateral damages of lockdown policies, of course, are heavy, varied, and will be felt for decades. And value judgments are inherent to all government decisions here. For example, weighing up harms to children versus virus deaths. This is not about following the science only. It's also about making, making sure that you have a good grasp of ethics. That's my opinion. A forceful and early non-pharmaceutical response in the course of the pandemic does seem to be a feature of many successful suppression strategies, like Norway and Finland being very successful examples. But many of these most successful ones have not applied lockdowns, even at the earliest stage. And then lengthy lockdown policies gradually undermine the immune resilience of a population. Through mental illness, inactivity, social isolation, business closures, and soaring unemployment, leading to heightened susceptibility to COVID-19, particularly in disadvantaged populations. And this may negate any potential benefit the lockdowns bring. So that concludes my talk. Thanks so much for listening. I'm now going to come out of screen share. And then I believe, David, we're going to have a short
questions. The first is that mortality and susceptibility are clearly very correlated for all sorts of reasons. And I just wanted to put just an interesting anecdote in here that I'm a son of a friend who's a medical student, is working in COVID ward in Leicester, and he said everybody in intensive care is obese. So that's just a kind of personal observation. It backs up.
Yeah, I mean that's come out of almost every study.
Yeah.
Obesity and metabolic health issues being absolutely top of the predictive list.
The second thing which we don't know, but which your hypothesis would predict would not be a great outcome, is the rebound effect after the lifting of lockdown, given that the immunosuppressant effects of lockdown would make people more susceptible.
Correct, and that would continue for a while. It doesn't. Those immunosuppressant effects don't just disappear when lockdown's lifted. That's exactly right. No. So I think that's important, because what I've just said does not mean that we should lift all lockdowns immediately in the UK, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's the case. Not least of which is that you have to manage the psyche of a population, and if everyone's bought in to the security that a lockdown feels like it brings, I think you have to then ensure that people are kind of are taken along with any changes that occur. Yeah, but absolutely. Now, in my journal article, I talk about the rebound effect more than I did in that talk. So again, if anyone would like to read that, because interestingly, the Zoe study and Tim Spector, who's led on that, some of you will know it, extraordinary study being led at King's. His data has said, suggested that particularly these kind of firebreak lockdowns lead to massive rebounds. And so it sounds like a great idea, lockdown for a couple of weeks, but actually you tend to get a horrible spike afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. We'll go into this in more detail. And my third observation is a general one, which is that the model you presented at the end, the biomedical and biopsychosocial, there's a lot of parallels between the exclusive germ theory of disease of Pasteur and then the terrain of Claude Bernard. And so the biopsychosocial looks at the terrain in terms of the overall susceptibility and immune function. And I think it's very interesting. That's something we could look at is what is the direction of travel? And obviously these are the complementary medical approach would tend to be more on the right-hand side than the left, but the left remains part of it, of course.
Absolutely, yes. So in the biopsychosocial model, it absolutely doesn't negate the importance of biological health, of pharmaceutical interventions, of ensuring that you're not exposed to things, particularly if you're very vulnerable. So yeah, so it's just got multiple levels. Well, as I say, I think that the UK's paradoxical situation of being so, throwing so much resource at it and failing so miserably does need some sort of explanation.
No. Yeah, Ollie, thank you.